I kept a grocery receipt because it was the last ordinary thing I touched before the evening lost its footing. Eggs, bread, spinach, tea. By the time I reached the lobby, I had the uneasy feeling that something small had already gone wrong. My name is Elias. I worked in records conservation, spending my days restoring damaged documents and deciding whether a problem came from water, heat, pressure, or simple neglect. I lived alone in my apartment, but I did not live alone in the building. Other tenants lived on the floors above and below me, and we all shared the same tired lobby, the same hesitant elevator, and the same habit of excusing small faults in old places. The building had been repaired so many times it no longer looked old in any single obvious way. The lobby had fresh paint in one corner and chipped tile in another. The elevator doors hesitated just long enough to make you notice them. The pipes clicked in winter. The building did not pretend to be modern, and I respected that. Things that are honest about their age are easier to understand. That evening, I came home with a paper bag pressed against my side and the eggs balanced badly on top. Rain had soaked the cuffs of my coat. The lobby smelled of wet fabric and radiator dust. Someone had left a parcel beside the mailboxes. The elevator stood with its doors closed, its display on L, waiting with the patience of a machine that had no reason to trust anyone. I stepped in, pressed the button for my floor, and felt the cab rise. Then it dipped. Not much. Just enough for my stomach to notice before my mind could decide whether I had imagined it. The display over the doors blinked blank. A soft click came from behind the panel, clean and mechanical, like a relay finding a contact it had not used in years. Then the car corrected itself and continued upward. By the time the doors opened, the display looked normal again. I carried the groceries inside, put the eggs away, and told myself that old buildings make old noises. That was the sort of sentence I had used for years whenever something did not fit neatly into a first glance. It was usually true. I wanted this to be one of those times. After dinner, I took the recycling downstairs. The cab arrived empty. I stepped in alone, pressed L, and caught a smell I knew too well from work: wet paper. Not laundry damp. Not mildew. Wet paper has its own kind of presence. It smells like pages that have begun to swell before they can dry, cardboard that has softened at the edges, envelopes that have lost the confidence of their seams. The floor was dry. The walls were dry. There was no box in the corner, no leak, no obvious reason for the smell. It faded before the doors opened on the lobby. I walked back in, still trying not to turn a small oddity into a story too quickly. The doors were still open when I reached the lobby again. I was about to step inside when the display above them changed. B2. It stayed there for less than 2 seconds, then vanished. I stood there with one hand on the edge of the door and looked into an empty cab that had just told me, in the language of a broken machine, that there was a floor below the basement. The building had one basement. I knew that because the laundry room was there, along with storage cages, a maintenance closet, and a vending machine that only worked if you pressed the coins in slowly. There was no tenant button for anything below it. The directory by the mailboxes listed the lobby, the basement, and the residential floors. No B2. No lower landing. Nothing that suggested the elevator had the right to say otherwise. I took a photograph of the display too late. The picture showed only a blank panel. I kept it anyway. It reminded me that memory is too eager to clean up after an event. A useless photograph can sometimes be more valuable than a sharp one because it preserves the exact failure of proof. I rode down to the basement and looked around carefully. Laundry machines. Storage cages. Concrete floor. Pipes. A cracked chair no one had claimed. Nothing that asked me to do anything except leave it alone. Near the far wall, partly hidden behind stacked plastic bins, I noticed a brass plate mounted low to the concrete. I had passed it many times without reading it. Most of the letters were covered in paint, but 2 words remained clear: service lift. I photographed that too. Then I opened the building app and checked the directory there. It matched the lobby sign: lobby, basement, residential floors. No lower level. The message board had complaints about radiator noise, a package left in the wrong alcove, and a missing gray cat that kept appearing near the laundry room whenever someone opened tuna. No one had written a word about B2. I searched the elevator model printed on the inspection card. One result said old display boards were often reused in different installations and might still contain labels from past configurations. That explained why a machine could show a floor name it was no longer supposed to use. It did not explain the wet paper smell. So I wrote a note before memory had the chance to polish it into something more impressive than it was. Elevator dipped slightly before rising. Display showed B2 for about 2 seconds. Wet paper smell inside cab. Brass plate in basement says service lift. No tenant directory lists B2. Then I added one more line in smaller writing. Ask the superintendent. His name was Tomas, and in the building he knew by sound. He was usually in the basement before most tenants had even made coffee, either fixing something that had failed overnight or preparing for something that looked ready to fail. He moved around with a rolling tool cart, and one wool chirped on the concrete, which meant you often heard him before you saw him. The next morning I found him near the laundry machines, tightening a valve with one hand while holding a phone against his shoulder with the other. When he finished his call, I asked the first question that mattered. Does this building have a second basement? He looked at me for a beat and said, No. Did it ever? Not in any version anyone pays me to clean. Why? I told him what I had seen. I did not decorate it. The cab had dipped. The display had shown B2. The smell had been like wet paper. There was a service lift plate in the basement. Tomas listened without making a face, which I appreciated more than I could say. He had the kind of expression that made room for uncertainty without pretending uncertainty was impossible. The panel is old, he said. Old panels keep labels they do not need. A dirty contact can make a display flash something from memory. The dip could be leveling. The smell could be basement air after rain. None of it is pleasant, but none of it is impossible. He said this the way a person speaks when he wants to be fair to both the machine and the person reporting it. Can it be checked before the controller resets? I asked. He nodded. I can call Abel. He knows this elevator better than I do. And do not hold the doors open while you study the display. I admitted that I had held them once. Then stop at once, he said, with the flat seriousness of someone who has seen enough doors and shafts to know that curiosity and gravity are not friends. Abel called me later that afternoon after Tomas gave him my number with my permission. Abel was the elevator technician assigned to the building. His voice had the same patient tone I had heard from repair people all my life, the tone people use when they have explained a machine to many worried tenants and are willing to explain it one more time without making anyone feel foolish. Can an elevator show a floor label that is not listed in the building? I asked. Yes, he said. Display boards are reused. Old controllers have landing tables. Sometimes the controller remembers more than the tenant panel offers. Does that mean there is a landing there? No, he said. It means the controller has a label or a mapped position. That could be old data, a sealed landing, a service stop, or nothing useful now. Could a reset erase that information? I asked. He paused before answering. A full reset can clear legacy mapping if we do not preserve it first. If you are worried about it, ask management to save the diagnostic data before the reset. I wrote that down word for word. The controller remembers more than the tenant panel offers. That was the sentence I underlined twice. I emailed Anika, the property manager. I explained the display, the slight movement, the smell, the service lift plate, and Abel's advice about preserving legacy mapping. She replied in the evening. Current approved plans show one basement level only. The controller reset is scheduled as part of routine modernization assessment. Please do not interfere with maintenance equipment. Thank you for reporting the issue. It was a reasonable reply. It also left too many things sitting beside each other without touching. That kind of answer does not end a question. It only gives it a place to wait. So I wrote a timeline of the evening, put the receipt in my notebook pocket because it belonged to the same hour, and added one more line before bed, talk to June. June lived one floor below me. She was in her 70s, careful with words, and the only person who could keep the lobby plant alive while still claiming she disliked it. The next night I found her watering it from a small metal can. When I asked whether she had ever heard of a lower service level, she did not look surprised. I noticed that immediately. I have heard people mention an old service landing, she said. Not a tenant space. Not somewhere anyone should go. Who mentioned it? Hazel, June said after a pause. She worked around the mechanical systems years ago. Her father did before her. She remembers things that do not sit comfortably inside newer plans. Can I speak with her? I asked. Not yet, June said. It was not the kind of answer that could have sounded evasive if she had turned away afterward, and she did not turn away. Why not? I asked. Because Hazel has been dismissed before, June said. I will not bring another person to her with only a flicker and a smell. Write down what you saw first. Then she can decide what she wants to say. I did not like the answer, but I understood it. At that moment the elevator doors opened behind us. No one stepped out. The cab was empty. The display went blank, then flashed B2, then returned to L. June saw it. A soft click came from below the floor. The air drifting out of the cab carried the same smell I had noticed before. Wet paper, and something like machine oil. Write that down, June said. Upstairs I did, then I emailed Tomas, Anika, and able to pause the reset until the controller data could be copied. I asked for the record to be preserved before the machine lost it. For 6 days, the elevator behaved itself. It rose when asked. It went down when asked. It opened slowly, groaning in the same places in the shaft as though the building were reciting an old habit. It did not show B2 again. The calm week helped more than I expected. It gave me time to compare the strange night with the rest of the building's normal life instead of letting the strange night become the whole story. Each ride stayed boring, which was exactly what I wanted. On the third day, Tomas let me watch the lobby camera from his small office behind the maintenance closet. The room smelled of old paint, dust, and coffee gone cold. Spare bulbs sat on one shelf. The calendar on the wall was still turned to the previous month. That room always looked like the inside of a decision that had been postponed too many times. On the monitor, the camera showed June with the watering can, then me beside her, then the elevator doors opening on an empty cab. No one stepped out. No one stepped in. The display on the camera feed was too blurred to read, but the timing matched my notes. Could someone have called it from the basement? I asked. Yes, Tomas said. Could someone have called it from below the basement? He looked at the screen for a moment longer than I expected. If there is a lower landing with an old call station, maybe, he said. That is not me saying there is one. I trusted the careful maybe more than any neat answer. Abel wanted the controller log before going further. June kept her word about Hazel in her own way. She did not hand me a number or a room number or a story. Instead, she brought me something Hazel had allowed her to share. It was a photocopy of an old basement photograph. June handed it to me in the lobby, not under my door and not like a test. She did it the way people do when they are trying to be fair to the limits of someone else's trust. Hazel asked me to give you this only after someone else saw B2 with you, June said. She wants you to compare it with the building before deciding what to do with it. The photograph showed the laundry area from years before. The machines were different. The support column was the same. The far wall, where storage bins now sat, appeared to have a narrow metal door. The label on the door was unreadable. The copy was too soft, and time had already covered parts of the original sign when the photograph was taken. Attached to the photocopy was a short note in June's handwriting: do not rely only on the plans that survived. That sentence is Hazel's, June said. The handwriting is mine. Her hands bother her now. That last sentence kept me from wondering later whether June had written the note herself. It was a small thing, but small things matter when a story is still pretending to be a set of unrelated noises. I thanked her and went downstairs by the stairs instead of taking the elevator, because I wanted to look at the basement with my own feet and not let the machine choose the route for me. In the basement, I moved the plastic bins away from the far wall one at a time. They held holiday decorations, old paint trays, a broken fan, and a box of papers labeled by year but not by contents. Behind them was painted concrete. No door. No obvious panel. But the wall had a seam. It was thin and almost lost under layers of beige paint. Near the floor, the concrete changed texture inside a rectangle about the width of the door in Hazel's photograph. I did not pry at it. I did not knock holes in the wall. I took photographs with a coin for scale, measured the distance from the support column, and put the bins back where I had found them. I wanted the next person to see the space in the same condition I had seen it. A hidden thing is easy to overstate once you have touched it. I had no intention of doing that. Then I checked records. The current plans were easy to find through the building app and the public permit portal. They showed one basement and no lower room. That matched Anika's email and Tomas's first answer. Older references were harder. The building had once been offices. One directory described secure record storage. Another mentioned a former family records office from decades earlier. The wording was plain enough that no one at the time would have thought it needed to be explained. Paper had been part of the building's life before apartments were. That mattered because of the smell. The wet paper smell no longer floated by itself in my mind. It had a possible source, but not yet a proven one. I made a timeline: office use, family records office, service lift repair, reported water damage, building sale, residential conversion, elevator alteration, modernization notice. The timeline did not solve anything. It just kept the pieces from scattering. It also helped me avoid blame. Anika had not managed the building during the conversion. Tomas had been hired after the basement was arranged as it was now. Abel knew the controller, not the old office records. June had memories and caution. Hazel had a photograph and a reason for waiting. No one had to behave badly for the current plans to be incomplete. A drawing can lose a room because one person calls it sealed, another person copies the clean drawing, and a third person trusts the copy. After enough years, the absence begins to look official. For the first time, the pieces sat together in a way that made sense. Not enough to settle the matter. Enough to keep going. That same night, Tomas called me from the basement office and told me the elevator had thrown a short maintenance warning without logging an error serious enough to disable it. He sounded tired, which made me trust him more. The system might be carrying old mapping, he said, but the thing that bothers me is the age of the wiring harness. It is not dangerous in the dramatic sense. It is just the kind of old that makes you notice how much trust is built into daily life. That sentence stayed with me. I had spent years handling paper with torn edges and damaged spines, and I had learned that objects rarely fail in the way people expect. They loosen. They drift. They become less faithful to the shape other people believe they should keep. The elevator felt like that to me now. Not hostile. Not haunted. Merely old enough to carry more memory than its current labels had room for. The next morning I took a flashlight and went back to the basement with the kind of purpose that looks casual only from a distance. I measured the painted seam again. The width was too even to be accidental. I looked at the corners of the rectangle near the floor and noticed tiny differences in the paint sheen where a door frame had once been sealed and repainted. The wall did not confess anything, but it also did not behave like ordinary uninterrupted concrete. I did not want to force the question with tools. I wanted the question answered by records, not by damage. So I spent the rest of the day at work requesting older files. Because I handled conservation material, I knew how to ask without alarming the entire system. I asked for permits, maintenance summaries, earlier building plans, and any notes linked to service lifts or lower storage spaces. Old buildings are always better explained by paper than by guesswork. The quiet week after that became a strange mixture of waiting and routine. I ate breakfast. I answered messages. I took the elevator to the street. I came back up with groceries. I started noticing how often I had never paid attention to the machine that moved me between floors because the machine usually agreed to be invisible. Once a machine stops agreeing, you begin to hear everything in it. On the third day, Tomas showed me a lobby camera clip with a freeze frame where the cab seemed to hesitate half a beat too long before the doors opened. That could have been a tired mechanism or a broken timestamp. It could also have been the sort of event a building forgets to eye because no one expected anyone to notice. I copied the clip, then played it again and again until I could stop myself from reading intention into a delay that might have meant nothing at all. Abel finally sent me a longer technical note. He did not overcomplicate it. The controller retained legacy landing data from a prior configuration. The tenant panel reflected the current floor list only. If the controller was called through service mode or if a contact fault crossed old logic at the wrong moment, the display could briefly surface a label that no longer belonged to the tenant experience. He added that the mapping should be copied before any reset, because modernizing a machine without preserving its legacy data can erase evidence of past arrangements. That was the first technical explanation that made the situation feel less mysterious and more concerning. Mystery usually thrives on vagueness. Practical detail weakens it by making it possible to follow. That was a relief. I did not want a supernatural problem. I wanted a comprehensible one. But comprehensible problems can still hide inconvenient history. June brought another item a day later. This time it was not a photograph but a copy of an old memorandum, softened by the copier and folded in a way that suggested it had been handled privately for years. It mentioned a lower record space, controlled access, and a service lift that had once connected the basement to an area below it. The language was cautious. It said nothing dramatic. It did not have to. The dry words were enough to change the shape of what I thought I knew. Hazel did not meet me yet. June explained that Hazel wanted to know whether I could keep a record without rushing to force a door. That annoyed me at first, because it sounded like someone testing whether I was impatient. Then I realized it was the opposite. She was testing whether I would turn an incomplete clue into a break-in. That was fair. While waiting, I kept recording normal rides. The elevator opened on my floor. It opened on the basement. It had the small shiver an old cab makes as the brake settles. It did not show B2 again. That would have been easier to dismiss if it had happened every time. Instead, its absence made the earlier event feel more specific. Machines can be wrong in ways that happen once and then never repeat because the conditions that produced a mistake no longer line up. That did not make me less curious. It made me more careful. Curious people are often told to calm down, but what actually helps is structure. So I made a page in my notebook with 3 columns. One for confirmed observations, one for possible explanations, and one for things I needed from other people rather than from my own guesses. It sounds almost childish when written that way, but the page kept me from chasing shadows. One confirmed observation, the smell. Another, the service lift plate. A possible explanation, old air moving through a sealed lower space when the elevator paused. A thing I needed from other people, a historical plan sheet. Another page in the notebook tracked people. Tomas knew the building's recent systems. Abel knew the controller. Anika held the current plan set. June knew Hazel. Hazel knew the older maintenance history. I knew documents and how they fail when people forget to respect them. I also wrote down what I did not know. I did not know whether the lower room still contained anything. I did not know who sealed it. I did not know whether B2 was a storage label, a service landing, or a forgotten room. I did not know whether anyone had ever intentionally hidden it or simply stopped caring once the room became inconvenient. Writing ignorance clearly is harder than writing certainty, but it kept the story honest. At work, I asked a records clerk about older institutional plans. She brought me a box tied with cotton tape. Inside were tax notices, inspection summaries, repair invoices, and folded plans from before the building became apartments. Most papers were routine. That helped, because routine papers show the skeleton of a place. They let you see how a building has moved through time without forcing one dramatic page to carry all the significance. One repair invoice mentioned a service lift. The attached sketch showed the elevator shaft extending below the public basement. Not far. Just enough for one more landing. Beside it was a narrow outlined space with the words "Lower Record Room." Above that, in smaller print, "Service Lift Access." I sat back and stared at the page until the words stopped looking impossible simply because they were smaller than the questions they had created. The clerk told me there should be a full plan sheet labeled B2. When she searched the box and found the index entry but no sheet, I felt the first unmistakable tug of structure turning into omission. There was no withdrawal note, no damage note, no sign-out slip. Only a thin pencil line through the entry. I photographed the index with permission. A missing sheet does not prove intent, but a missing sheet that matches exactly the thing you need to explain is never just accidental in the emotional sense, even if it is accidental in the bureaucratic one. I sent Anika another calm email with the old service sketch, the current basement plan, and a photograph of the painted seam. I asked again that the controller reset be postponed until Abel could copy the legacy mapping. This time she called instead of replying. "Old records can be misleading," she said. "Buildings change. Spaces are sealed. A sealed space is not tenant space." I said I agreed, and that I was not asking anyone to enter it. I was asking for data to be copied before a reset. "The modernization is routine," she said. "Preserve the data," I answered. That evening Tomas knocked on my door. He had seen the email. I showed him the sketch on my laptop, and he leaned close to compare the mark with the plate. We went downstairs with a flashlight and checked the brass plate again. The scratch was still there, plain in the old paint, and Tomas left it at that. A few hours later Abel forwarded a short service note through Tomas. The old controller held more landing positions than the tenant panel displayed. The label table was damaged but not unreadable. A reset might overwrite the stored map unless it was copied first. He added one plain sentence: "Legacy mapping should be preserved before modernization." After that, the email stopped sounding routine and started sounding like the beginning of a record someone might someday need in court. The next morning Abel came to the building with a diagnostic tablet. Anika joined by phone. Tomas stood near the panel. June watched from the laundry table, holding her purse strap with both hands. Nobody opened the sealed area. Nobody stepped where they were not allowed. Abel connected the tablet, copied the controller data, and studied the landing table in silence. Then he looked up and said, "There is a legacy call below the basement. Disabled from the tenant panel. Still mapped." Abel said it could be called under service control, with the doors held and no one stepping out. I went back to the records office the next morning with a copy of the old sketch, the current basement plan, a note from Abel, and the photograph of the seam in the wall. I did not go in with a conclusion. I went in with enough pieces that I could ask for the right box without sounding as if I wanted drama from the clerk on duty. That mattered. A good records office is a place where curiosity should sound organized. The clerk brought out a box tied with cotton tape. Inside were tax notices, inspection summaries, repair invoices, and folded plans from before the building became apartments. I use pencil only. That is a habit from conservation work. Ink makes people careless. Pencil makes you think before you commit. I opened each sheet slowly. Most of the papers were routine, and I was grateful for that. Routine is the scaffolding that lets you trust the unusual when it finally appears. One repair invoice mentioned the service lift again. The attached sketch showed the elevator shaft extending below the public basement. The lower space was narrow, but it was there. Not hidden in a way that felt theatrical. Hidden in the ordinary bureaucratic way that happens when everyone assumes someone else has already indexed the important part. That is often how absent rooms survive inside institutions, by being too unremarkable to defend. Beside the outlined lower space was the label "Lower Record Room." Above it, in smaller print, "Service Lift Access." I sat back without touching the page for a moment. The words were not large. They did not need to be. The size of a label does not determine the size of the consequence. I requested a scan and asked whether there should also be a full sheet marked B2. The clerk checked the index and frowned. "There should be," she said. Can I see it? I asked. She searched the box again, then the folder behind it, then the inventory sheet. It is listed, she said, but it is not here. There was no withdrawal note, no damage note, no sign-out slip. Only a thin pencil line through the entry. I photographed the index with her permission and thanked her carefully. She looked at the entry once more, as if looking harder could make a page return. A missing sheet does not mean someone took it on purpose. Old files lose pages in many ways. But when the missing page is exactly the one that would explain the lower room, I could not treat that as nothing. I sent Anika a new email with 3 attachments, the old service sketch, the current basement plan, and the photograph of the painted seam. I asked again that the reset be postponed until the legacy map had been copied. Old records can be misleading, she said. I only wanted the data copied before the reset. That evening Tomas came by again, and we compared the sketch with the plate. The mark matched, so we moved on. We went down together to check the lower note one more time before returning to the records office. Tomas shined the flashlight across the paint, then nodded once and stopped trying to make it more than it was. The note was enough to keep the reset on hold. The next morning, Abel came with the diagnostic tablet. Anika joined by phone. Tomas stood near the panel. June watched from the laundry table. Nobody opened the sealed area. Nobody stepped where they were not allowed. Abel copied the controller data, then studied the landing table without speaking for a very long time. When he finally looked up, he said there was a legacy call below the basement, disabled from the tenant panel but still mapped. The room changed after that sentence, even though no one moved. By then the question was no longer whether the elevator could reach the landing, it was whether we were ready to document it properly. June looked toward the elevator as if she had already seen the next part and did not want to be the only one who had. She did not speak, but the grip on her purse strap tightened. She had been waiting for an answer long enough to know that answers often make people more careful rather than less. That kind of caution is not fear. It is respect for the fact that a place can be real without yet being open. Abel put the elevator into service mode. The tenant buttons went dark. The display blanked. Inside the cab, the air seemed to stop moving. We descended to the basement first, then lower. Not far. That surprised me more than a long drop would have. The movement was small, practical, almost shy, the kind of distance a building can erase from a drawing and still remain complete to the people living above it. The cab stopped with a muffled sound. The doors opened 3 inches and paused. Door resistance, Abel said. Holding. The doors shuddered, then opened wider. Beyond them was a narrow concrete landing. A metal gate stood directly in front of the elevator. Behind the gate was an old door painted the same dull color as the basement machinery. A padlock held the gate closed. Dust covered the hinges. The air that came through the gaps smelled of cold concrete, old oil, and wet paper. A small sign hung crooked on the door. B2. Below it, another line was covered by grime. For a few seconds nobody said anything. Then Abel said, "That is enough for now." "Can the gate be opened?" I asked. "Not by us today," he said. "Not without building safety, air testing, authorization, and someone qualified to deal with whatever paper is behind that door." That sentence quieted all of us at once. June had not stepped out of the cab. She looked at the door with an expression I could not name immediately. It was not fear exactly. It was recognition held back for a long time. "You knew there was something here," I said quietly. "I knew Hazel was right about a door," June said. "I did not know what the room was like now." "Those are different things." She was right. Knowing a room existed is not the same as knowing what has survived inside it. Abel returned us to the basement and repeated the call once while recording the diagnostic screen. Tomas photographed the service panel before and after. I photographed the landing from inside the cab, keeping the locked gate in the frame. June wrote the time in the small calendar she carried in her bag. "Why the calendar?" I asked. "Because it will still open when the internet is tired," she said. The second call showed the same landing, the same sign, the same smell. Seeing the same thing twice made it harder to pretend it was a mistake. Abel wrote the service statement. Tomas posted a temporary warning. Useful. Dull. Clear. Anika called less than an hour later and agreed no one should enter without official inspection. That evening June came to my apartment with Hazel's permission to arrange a visit. This time she did not bring another note. She brought a reason. Hazel will speak to you tomorrow, she said. She wanted the landing verified first because she has told people before and been treated as if memory were the problem. She also wanted to know you would not climb through anything. I told her I would not. Good, she said. She has waited a long time. She does not want someone impatient to become part of the damage. That was the simplest summary. Some rooms are hard not to find, but hard to enter responsibly. June took me to see Hazel the next afternoon. Hazel lived in a quiet care building where the hall smelled of clean sheets, soup, and cut flowers. She sat beside a window with a blanket over her knees and a stack of envelopes on the table. Her hair was silver and pinned back. Her eyes went first to the folder under my arm. You brought copies, she said. Yes, I said. Good. I placed the folder on the table and laid out the papers one by one. Photographs. Notes. The old service sketch. The current plan. Abel's statement. Anika's replies. The missing sheet entry. The landing photographs. Hazel touched the folder with 2 fingers and studied the first page for a long moment. Then she nodded, as if some internal argument had finally been given enough evidence to stop shouting. Now we can talk, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it had the force of someone who had been waiting for the right conditions rather than the right mood. She told me her father had maintained the service lift when the building still held offices. Later, she helped him, first by carrying tools, then by doing paid maintenance work herself. The lower room, she said, was built for paper. Cooler air. No windows. Locked access. That was the idea. Family records? I asked. Yes, she said. Placement notes, guardianship papers, letters, ledgers, forms. Some belonged in public custody. Some belonged with successor offices. Some belonged to people who came asking years later and were told there was nothing to find. She said this without making it dramatic. That made it worse in a useful way. Drama invites disbelief. Plain language invites accountability. She opened one envelope and showed me a copy of a maintenance sheet. Near the bottom was the same penciled H I had seen on the service sketch and the plate. My father marked jobs that way, Hazel said. Then I did too. A habit. Not a code. That explained the mark. It was never meant to be a secret signal. It was a maintenance habit that survived long enough to become useful evidence by accident. I asked why the room had been sealed. Hazel answered carefully. There was a leak after the office closed. A train backed up. Boxes near one wall were damaged. The records were supposed to be transferred, but damaged paper costs money to dry, sort, and describe. The building was sold. Apartments were planned. The lower room was inconvenient. Damp, below tenant use, connected to old elevator equipment, full of records that required special handling. Who ordered it sealed? I asked. I do not know, she said quickly. I believed her because she did not try to fill the gap. I know the room existed, she continued. I know records were still there when they should have been transferred. I know a lower plan sheet existed. I know later people were told the current plan showed nothing below the basement. I do not know whose hand made each choice. That distinction mattered. People often pretend uncertainty is the same as ignorance. It is not. Hazel knew where her memory stopped. That made her more reliable, not less. When someone can say I do not know, the things they do know become easier to trust. I asked why she had waited to speak through June instead of going straight to management. Hazel looked at June before answering. I did not wait without trying, she said. I wrote letters years ago. I called the agency that inherited part of the old office work. I mentioned the room when an elevator permit was posted. I was told I might be remembering another building. I was told sealed spaces are often crawl spaces. I was told that if records were important, they would be in an inventory. Her voice never rose. That made it harder to dismiss. When the modernization notice appeared, she said, I worried the old controller would lose the last practical trace that the lower landing had been mapped. I could not enter the shaft. I could not ask June to do anything unsafe. I needed a current tenant to document what the building did now. Why me? I asked, though I suspected the answer. Because last winter, Tomas found a wet box of old tenant ledgers in a storage cage, she said. You made him photograph the covers and call the records desk before throwing anything away. Most pages were ordinary. You still checked. I remembered that box. It had taken less than an hour to do the right thing with it, which was exactly why Hazel remembered it. To her, the habit mattered. You already knew, she said, that wet paper can matter before anyone knows whose life is inside it. I did not know how to respond to that except by keeping my hands still and letting the sentence settle. She had understood my work more clearly than I had understood its possible usefulness in this building. June had her own reason too, and when she explained it, the earlier caution finally made full sense. Her brother had been placed through an office connected to the building many years earlier. Family illness. Poverty. Relatives making promises. Officials writing decisions. He had searched for records as an adult and been told the files from that period were destroyed by water. I do not know that his file is in that room, June said. I only know it might be. I did not want to place that hope on your shoulders before there was a safe process. That was not withholding. That was care. She had been protecting the possibility that a record might still exist from being turned into pressure before anyone knew whether it could be recovered. I understood then that both women had been trying to stop me from becoming careless with their history. Hazel leaned forward. No one enters that room casually, she said. Air test first. Photographs before movement. Conservators present. Chain of custody. Privacy review. Counseling referrals if personal files are found. Those papers are not props. They are parts of people's lives. It was the clearest instruction anyone had given me since the elevator first dipped. She said it with the authority of someone who had spent years watching paper survive the wrong hands. I left with Hazel's signed statement, copies of 2 maintenance sheets, and her permission for the Records Authority and Building Safety Office to reach her through June. She did not want her private details passed through the general management chain. She was not dodging the process. She was setting a boundary. There is a difference, and the difference matters when records are involved. On the way home I wrote the report in plain language. Legacy lower landing verified by elevator technician. Unlisted B2 door visible beyond locked gate. Current plans conflict with older service sketch. Former lower record room associated with family records. Strong smell consistent with water damage paper. Scheduled reset postponed. Request coordinated inspection with building safety, elevator contractor, and records conservator. I attached everything. By evening, the reset had been postponed. By morning, a joint inspection had been scheduled. A records conservator named Lena called me and asked the right questions before introducing herself fully. Has anyone opened the door? No. Good. Has anyone swept, sprayed, moved boxes, or tried to improve the scene? No. Better. Treat it as a wet archive until proven otherwise. Hazel sounds like someone people should have listened to sooner, Lena said. I smiled despite myself because the sentence was blunt and true. The inspection was set for Thursday morning. For the first time since the receipt, I did not spend the night trying to work out what should happen next. Other people were trained for that part. That was a relief I had not known I needed. On Thursday morning, the elevator carried us to B2 under service control. Abel watched the panel. Tomas held the copied controller log. Lena carried her equipment case. Two inspectors stood near the door. Anika had a folder thick with printed plans. June stood beside me with both hands around her purse strap. Hazel was not there. The trip would have been too hard for her. June had promised to call as soon as there was something honest to report. The air test came first. Lena and the inspectors checked the landing through the gap in the gate and then again after a small adjustment to the cab position. No one rushed. No one touched a box first and asked a question later. Photographs of the gate came next, then photographs of the lock, then photographs of the door sign. Everything had to be documented before anything moved. That discipline made the moment feel less like discovery and more like responsibility. When the inspectors finally opened the gate and the old door, the hinges moved slowly. Rust had taken its share of the years. Beyond the threshold was a smaller room than I had pictured. Metal cabinets lined one wall. Cardboard boxes sat on raised shelves. Some had collapsed from damp, their sides bowed inward. Others remained square enough to keep their labels. A dark stain ran down the south corner to a floor drain that had been blocked years before. In the center of the room stood a wooden table. A ledger lay open on it. On the inside of the door was a sign. Lower record room. Below it, written in pencil, were 5 words, transfer pending. Do not discard. Lena closed her eyes for one moment and then opened them again with the practical focus of someone who knew exactly how much work such a sentence implied. After that, B2 became a work site. No one lifted a box before it was photographed. The threshold, shelves, drain, waterline, cabinets, door sign, scratched H marks, controller data, and missing sheet entry were all documented. Fans came in later through filters. Humidity was measured. Mold risk was checked. The first things removed were not records but air samples and photographs. That may sound slow. It was. Slowness was the right speed for a room that had already suffered from being treated as less important than the people it contained. The room had not been empty. That settled the first thing. The rest came slowly. The records belonged to the former family records office. Some were destroyed by water. Some were fused into blocks that could only be stabilized before they could be separated. Many survived because the shelves had kept them above the worst damp. There were ledgers, index cards, guardianship papers, placement notes, letters, intake forms, and bundles tied with cotton string. Not valuable in the way people usually use that word. More valuable for the people whose lives had been described inside them. Lena's team took custody of the salvageable material. Each crate had a number. Each number had a photograph. Each photograph had a note saying where the object had been found before anyone moved it. It was careful work, almost ceremonial, but not in a romantic way. In a custodial way. That is the better word. While they worked, I watched how often people almost spoke the wrong sentence and then stopped themselves. A recovered record can wound if handed over without care. Names, promises, errors, grief, and decisions made under pressure all need context. The room had already suffered from people treating paper as an inconvenience. Lena would not let the repair make the opposite mistake. The official explanation, once it was written up, was plain. After the former office closed, its records were supposed to be transferred. Before that happened, a train backed up and damaged part of the lower room. The transfer was marked pending because the paper needed drying and sorting. Then ownership changed. The apartment conversion treated the lower room as a sealed liability, damp, below tenant access, full of protected records, and connected to old elevator equipment. The stair access was closed. The lower gate was locked for safety after a contractor noted mold risk and no approved tenant access. During conversion, the lower plan sheet was removed from the active set because the room had been marked sealed, no tenant occupancy. The elevator landing stayed inside the old controller because there was no tenant button for it and no one needed to call it in daily use. One narrow duty after another produced a white failure. That sentence went into my notebook because it explained too much and too little at once. It also explained Anika. The later review did not show that she had known about B2 before the reports. She had inherited the current plans and trusted them. At a residents' meeting, she apologized plainly. The approved drawings were incomplete, she said. We should have paused the reset sooner. We are correcting the record. That did not undo anything, but it mattered that she said it out loud. In any building, there is a difference between being wrong and pretending not to be wrong. The smaller things made sense one by one. The elevator had displayed B2 because the old controller still held a legacy landing map. The tenant panel had no button for it, but service mode could call the cab there. The empty elevator in the lobby had not been called by an unseen person. Tomas had tested the basement panel earlier that day, and a dirty contact delayed one service input. The controller completed the old call after he had left. That was why the cab opened with no one inside. The wet paper smell had reached the cab through pressure changes in the shaft. When the elevator stopped near the lower landing, air moved from the sealed room into the cab. The machine oil smell came from the lower gate and service lock, which Tomas had lubricated during routine testing. The service lift plate marked the older access route. The scratched H marks belonged first to Hazel's father and then to Hazel, a maintenance habit that became a bridge between paper, metal, and memory. June's photocopy had come from Hazel's old folder. It had not named the room because the sign was already unreadable in the copy. June had brought it only after another person saw B2 with me because Hazel wanted the building to speak before she did. The missing B2 sheet was later found in a box of conversion closeout papers filed with elevator and drainage invoices. A clerk had crossed the public index line after the lower level was marked sealed. The clerk had treated access as the only thing that mattered. No one had asked what remained inside. That was how the room slipped out of ordinary use. Not all at once. One form at a time. That felt like the truest sentence in the whole story. Large mistakes are often just sequences of small administrative choices that nobody thinks will ever need explaining. Hazel visited after the room was made safe. Tomas arranged a chair near the elevator because she could not stand for long. June held her arm. Lena had installed temporary lights and cleared a safe path. When the display showed B2, Hazel looked up at it as if greeting something that had finally stopped being argued with. I rode down with them. The lower room no longer smelled strongly of wet paper. It smelled of fans, dust, archival boxes, and careful work. The gate had been removed. The old door stood open. Hazel placed her hand on the doorframe over the scratched H. There you are, she said. Nothing more. Nothing more was needed. Some moments earned their own silence. This was one of them. The morning after the inspection, B2 stopped feeling like a question and started feeling like a worksite. Lena came down with filters, labels, and the calm authority of someone who understood that a room full of paper could not be rushed just because people were relieved to have found it. Nobody lifted a box until the landing had been photographed, measured, and logged. Nobody guessed. Nobody improvised. For the first time, the lower room was being treated as a place that had deserved attention all along. The first boxes told the story in a plain way that was almost harder to hear than a dramatic one. Some records had been damaged by water. Some were still usable. Some had been packed for transfer and then left behind when the building changed hands. There was no single villain waiting at the end of the file. There was only a chain of incomplete handoffs, bad assumptions, and one quiet delay after another until the room became easier to ignore than to fix. That was the real damage. It had happened slowly enough to feel normal. Lena explained the next steps before anyone touched the shelves again. Air testing first. Photographs first. Inventory second. Stabilization third. Privacy review before anything personal could leave the room. Her voice made the process sound less like a rescue and more like a duty, which was exactly the right tone. The papers had already survived being treated carelessly. They were not going to survive being treated theatrically. That was the difference between helping and performing. Hazel came down a few days later, slower than before but steadier. When she saw the shelves, she did not speak at first. Then she asked Lena for the boxes that matched the old maintenance notes. Her father's marks were there, exactly where she had said they would be. Not a code. Not a secret system. Just a habit that had survived long enough to become evidence. Hazel looked at the mark for a long moment and then nodded once, as if something she had carried for years had finally been returned to the right shelf. June received the copy she had been waiting for soon after. Her brother's file had not been destroyed. It had been misfiled, then overlooked, then nearly lost inside the gap between old office work and residential conversion. When she learned that, she did not cry in the dramatic way people expect. She just sat very still, as if her body needed time to accept that the blank space in her life had not been empty after all. It had only been misplaced. That was a gentler truth than the one she had been living with, but it still changed everything. The room itself made sense in a way the old drawings had not. The lower archive had been built for paper when the building still held offices. There had been cooler air, controlled access, and a service route that once made sense to the people who used it every day. Then a leak damaged part of the room. Records that were supposed to move stayed put. Ownership changed. The apartment conversion treated the space as sealed, and once the active drawings were cleaned up, the lower sheet stopped being copied forward. Nobody needed to invent a cover-up. The room slipped away because the paperwork was allowed to stop noticing it. Anika corrected the building records and sent the notice herself. It was brief, direct, and unusually plain. The current plan set had been incomplete, the lower archival access had existed, and the building documents had now been corrected. Abel updated the elevator mapping so B2 no longer appeared on the tenant display. Tomas replaced the temporary warning with a permanent maintenance note. The building was not made special by any of this. It was made accurate. That mattered more than spectacle ever could. For a while after that, I kept thinking about the grocery receipt. Eggs, bread, spinach, tea. It was the most ordinary piece of paper in the whole story, and it had survived because I had put it in my notebook before the evening could rearrange itself into something harder to explain. That became the lesson I kept returning to. Small notes matter. The first odd detail matters. A copy matters. A missing page matters. If someone writes it down early enough, a place can be understood before it is simplified out of existence. Lena spent the next days cataloging what could safely be moved and marking what had to stay where it was until the paper could be stabilized. Some boxes opened cleanly. Some needed treatment before anyone could separate the pages. Some names appeared in ledgers with dates that did not quite match the older index cards. Each discrepancy was small on its own. Together they explained why the room had mattered so much to Hazel and June. It had not only stored records. It had held the leftover shape of decisions people were supposed to remember. June came back one afternoon with a thermos of tea and asked Lena a question that would have sounded simple to anyone else, whether a file could be searched by office date instead of family name. She asked it carefully, with enough respect for privacy that nobody had to remind her to slow down. When she later told me her brother had started asking practical questions instead of only emotional ones, I understood how much had changed. He was no longer fighting the fact that the file existed. He was trying to understand what it meant. That was its own kind of recovery. Hazel, for her part, seemed most relieved when people stopped treating the room like a revelation and started treating it like a responsibility. She asked to see the condition notes, pointed out a binding detail in one of the ledgers, and quietly corrected a date that had been copied wrong years before. It was never about proving she had been right. It was about seeing the room in full, including the work that had gone into saving it after everyone else had walked past. She smiled once, briefly, and that was enough. Tomas kept doing what he always did best, boring work. He checked the hinge bolts. He watched the elevator again after the mapping was updated. He replaced a worn label without making a story out of it. The cab no longer showed B2 unless authorized staff asked for archival access, and even then it behaved like an ordinary machine performing an ordinary task. That was a relief. A machine that once looked like a riddle should become a routine responsibility again, now a legend. By the time the final clean shelf labels were posted, the building had gone back to sounding like itself. The elevator opened on L. The lobby plant looked healthier. The basement smelled like dust, cardboard, and filter air instead of wet paper. Nothing dramatic happened, which was exactly the point. The room had not vanished. It had been restored to the record. The floor had never been a mystery at all. It had been a part of the building that the paperwork had failed to keep up with until someone finally asked the right question. And that was where the story ended for me, not with a secret, but with a correction. The building was ordinary again, and this time ordinary meant honest.